My daughter's piano teacher kept criticizing her playing for no reason. Then my wife walked into the recital, and he couldn't stop complimenting everything. I was standing in the back of the recital hall, watching Mr. Finch lean close to my wife Diana, his hand gesturing animatedly at the program, when I realized my 8-year-old daughter Sophie had been sitting alone at the piano bench for almost 3 minutes, waiting for him to give her the signal to start. The other parents were starting to shift in their seats and whisper. Sophie's small hands were folded in her lap, her face pale under the stage lights. Mr. Finch was still talking to Diana, laughing at something she'd said, completely oblivious that he'd forgotten to cue his own student. I watched my daughter's shoulders curve inward, watched her glance toward us with those enormous brown eyes full of confusion and shame, and something inside my chest cracked open. This man had spent 6 months convincing my daughter she had no musical talent, and now he couldn't even remember she existed because my wife smiled at him. Sophie started piano lessons in September after begging us for months to learn. She'd always loved music, would dance around the living room to anything with a melody, and had this way of humming harmonies that surprised me. Diana found Mr. Garrett Finch through a parent at Sophie's school who said he was strict but excellent, that he'd trained several students who went on to prestigious music programs. His studio was in a converted carriage house behind a Victorian mansion on the wealthy side of town, all hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows. When we met him for the consultation, he seemed professional and knowledgeable. He had a music degree from a conservatory, 15 years of teaching experience, and a wall covered in certificates and photos of student performances. He told Sophie that piano required discipline and dedication, but if she worked hard, she could become quite good. She nodded seriously and promised she would practice every single day. The first month went fine. Sophie came home from lessons talking about proper hand position and counting rhythms. She practiced 30 minutes every afternoon without complaint. Mr. Finch sent brief emails updating me on her progress, nothing effusive, but nothing concerning either. Then in October, something shifted. Sophie started coming home from lessons quieter, less enthusiastic. When I asked how it went, she'd shrug and say it was okay. Her practice sessions became tense, full of frustrated sighs and starting over. I figured she was hitting the natural difficulty curve, where beginners realize music takes actual work. The first red flag came in early November when I picked Sophie up from her lesson. I arrived 5 minutes early and could hear Mr. Finch's voice through the studio door. He was telling Sophie that her rhythm was sloppy, that she clearly hadn't practiced enough, that other students her age were already playing more complex pieces. His tone was cold and dismissive. When Sophie emerged, her eyes were red and she wouldn't look at me. I asked Mr. Finch if everything was all right, and he smiled tightly and said Sophie needed to focus more, that she had potential but wasn't applying herself. On the drive home, Sophie said quietly that she tried really hard, but Mr. Finch said her playing hurt his ears. I told myself strict teachers pushed students to excellence. I remembered my own childhood music teacher who'd been demanding, but ultimately made me better. I told Sophie that criticism meant he believed in her abilities, that he wouldn't bother correcting her if he didn't think she could improve. She nodded, but didn't seem convinced. That week, I sat with her during practice, helped her count out rhythms, praised her when she got sections right. She seemed more confident by her next lesson. But when I picked her up, she was crying again. Mr. Finch told me she'd played the piece entirely wrong despite claiming she practiced, that perhaps she didn't have the discipline for piano. I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my voice calm. I asked if we could schedule a conference to discuss her progress and his teaching approach. He said he had a very busy schedule but could spare 15 minutes next week. The conference was in his studio on a Thursday evening. I came straight from work, still in my office clothes. Mr. Finch sat behind his desk with Sophie's practice journal open in front of him. He went through each week, pointing out where she'd failed to meet practice time goals, where her notes indicated struggling with concepts. He said Sophie lacked natural musicality, that her fingers were too short for proper technique, that her counting was consistently off. I listened to him list my daughter's deficiencies for 12 minutes straight. When I finally interrupted to ask if he saw any strengths or progress, he paused and said she had adequate posture. That was it. Adequate posture. I asked if perhaps his teaching method wasn't the right fit for her learning style. Mr. Finch's expression hardened, and he said he'd been teaching piano for 15 years and knew when a student had potential versus when parents were pushing their child into something they weren't suited for. The implication was clear. I was a delusional father forcing his talentless daughter to waste everyone's time. I left that meeting furious but also doubting. Maybe Sophie really wasn't cut out for piano. Maybe I was projecting my own wishes onto her. But when I got home and found her at the piano playing through her pieces with genuine concentration, when I saw how carefully she positioned her hands and counted under her breath, I couldn't reconcile Mr. Finch's assessment with what I was seeing. Diana suggested we get a second opinion, maybe have another teacher evaluate Sophie. I contacted Mrs. Leanne Cho, a piano instructor recommended by our neighbor. She agreed to listen to Sophie play and give us an honest assessment. Mrs. Cho came to our house on a Saturday morning. She had 32 years of teaching experience and had served on the board of the State Music Teachers Association. Sophie played 3 pieces she'd been working on with Mr. Finch. Mrs. Cho listened carefully, occasionally asking Sophie to repeat a section or explain her understanding of the rhythm. When Sophie finished, Mrs. Cho smiled and told her she had a lovely touch and good instincts. She said Sophie's technique needed refinement, which was completely normal for someone who'd only been playing a few months, but her musicality was evident. After Sophie left the room, Mrs. Cho asked me about Mr. Finch's teaching methods. I described his constant criticism and his assessment that Sophie lacked talent. Mrs. Cho's expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. She said Sophie absolutely had potential, and that the technical issues she observed were exactly what you'd expect from a beginner receiving inconsistent instruction. She asked if Mr. Finch demonstrated techniques for Sophie, or mostly just pointed out errors. I realized I didn't know. I'd never actually observed a full lesson. I asked Mr. Finch if I could sit in on Sophie's next lesson to better understand how to help her practice at home. He said parents observing made students self-conscious and performed worse, that it was his policy to teach one-on-one. I pressed and said I'd sit quietly in the corner, that I needed to see what Sophie was working on. He reluctantly agreed, but made it clear this was an exception. The lesson was scheduled for Wednesday at 4:30. I rearranged my work schedule to be there by 4:15. The studio had a small waiting area separated from the teaching room by a glass door. I could see and hear everything. Mr. Finch started the lesson by having Sophie play a scale. She made it through with only one small stumble. He immediately pointed out the mistake and had her start over. She played it again, perfectly this time. He said her tempo was inconsistent. She played it a third time. He said her wrist position was wrong. She adjusted and played it again. He said it was marginally better, but showed she hadn't been practicing properly. Sophie's shoulders were already hunched, her confidence visibly deflating. They moved to her assigned piece, a simple melody that she'd practiced extensively. She played through the first page with minor errors. Mr. Finch stopped her and said she was rushing, that she clearly hadn't bothered to use a metronome like he'd instructed. Sophie said quietly that she had used the metronome every day. He said if that were true, her timing wouldn't be so poor. She started again, slower, more hesitant. Every 8 measures or so, he'd stop her to point out a wrong note or poor phrasing. By the end of the 30-minute lesson, Sophie had played maybe 4 minutes of actual music. The rest was him criticizing and her apologizing. I walked out of that studio shaking with anger. In the car, Sophie asked if I thought she did badly. I told her she did wonderfully, and that Mr. Finch was wrong about her timing. She looked at me with such desperate hope that I had to look away before I started crying. That evening, Diana and I talked about pulling Sophie from lessons entirely. But Sophie, despite everything, still wanted to play piano. She loved music. She just hated Mr. Finch. We decided to document everything and then switch teachers, but we needed to fulfill the contract through December when the winter recital happened. I started recording Sophie's practice sessions on my phone to prove she was putting in the work. I kept detailed notes of what Mr. Finch said during lessons versus what I observed Sophie actually doing. November bled into December, and Mr. Finch's treatment got worse. He assigned Sophie a recital piece that was too advanced for her skill level, then berated her when she couldn't play it perfectly within 2 weeks. He told her she was holding back the other students because he had to spend so much time correcting her basic mistakes. He suggested maybe she should sit out the recital and try again next year when she'd had more time to develop basic competency. Sophie came home that day and said she didn't want to do the recital, that she would just embarrass herself. I told her Mr. Finch was a bad teacher, and we were switching instructors in January. She asked why we had to wait. I explained about the contract and the recital that we'd already paid for. She said she didn't care about the money. She just wanted to stop feeling stupid all the time. I contacted 3 other parents whose children studied with Mr. Finch. 2 said their kids were doing fine, that Mr. Finch was demanding but fair. The 3rd parent, a woman named Catherine Odom, asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a cafe downtown on a Saturday afternoon. Catherine said her daughter Lily had studied with Mr. Finch for 8 months before Catherine pulled her out. Lily had developed such severe performance anxiety that she couldn't play in front of anyone anymore, even family. Catherine said Mr. Finch had been relentlessly critical of Lily, constantly comparing her unfavorably to other students, making her redo pieces over and over while pointing out every microscopic flaw. Catherine tried talking to him about his teaching approach, and he'd told her that musical excellence required high standards, that coddling children produced mediocre musicians. She asked if I'd noticed whether Mr. Finch had favorite students who he praised constantly. I said I'd never seen him interact with other students. Catherine said that was the pattern. He'd destroy some students' confidence while building up others, seemingly at random. She'd talked to another parent whose son was one of the favorites, and that parent had been shocked to hear Lily's experience because Mr. Finch was always encouraging and positive with their child. I asked Catherine if she'd filed a complaint with any music teaching organization. She said she'd reported him to the State Music Teachers Association, but they said without evidence of abuse or misconduct, they couldn't intervene in teaching style differences. I asked if she still had documentation from when Lily was taking lessons. She said she had emails and recordings of Lily crying after lessons. I told her about Sophie's situation and asked if she'd be willing to share those materials if I decided to pursue a formal complaint. She said absolutely, that she'd felt guilty for not doing more when Lily was suffering. We exchanged contact information, and Catherine said to call her if I needed anything, even just someone to vent to who understood. The winter recital was scheduled for December 18th at 7 in the evening at a church with a good piano and acoustic space. All of Mr. Finch's students would perform, about 20 kids ranging from age 6 to 16. Sophie had been practicing her piece obsessively, despite Mr. Finch telling her she wasn't ready. I'd been coaching her at home, building her confidence, reminding her that she could play it, and his opinion didn't define her abilities. Diana had a work conflict that week, a major client presentation that got scheduled at the last minute. She was supposed to miss the recital, which devastated Sophie, but Diana promised she'd make it up to her. The afternoon of the recital, Diana's presentation got canceled. The client rescheduled to January. She called me at 3 and said she could make it to Sophie's performance after all. I texted Sophie's grandparents and Diana's sister to let them know she'd be there. Everyone was excited. Sophie was thrilled when I told her mom would be watching. She practiced her piece one more time before we left for the church. Diana met us there, coming straight from the office in a charcoal gray dress and heels, her dark hair pulled back, minimal makeup but polished. She hugged Sophie and told her she wouldn't miss this for anything. We found seats in the 4th row. The recital program listed students in order of age and skill level. Sophie was performing 9th, after the younger beginners, but before the intermediate students. The first 8 students performed. Some were very young and charmingly shaky, others were more polished. Mr. Finch stood to the side of the stage, cueing each student to begin, then sitting in the front row while they played. After each performance, he'd stand and offer a few words of commentary, praising technique or interpretation. He smiled at the students, called them by name, used words like excellent and impressive improvement. I felt sick watching him be warm and encouraging to these other children while he'd spent months destroying Sophie's confidence. Diana leaned over and whispered that he seemed like a good teacher. I said quietly that she should wait and see how he treated Sophie. Sophie's name was called. She stood and walked to the stage, her emerald green dress making her look tiny under the lights. She sat at the piano bench and arranged her music. Mr. Finch started to walk toward the front row like he had with the other students, then he glanced back and saw Diana. He stopped mid-step. I watched his entire demeanor shift. He stood up straighter, smoothed his tie, and walked back to stand near the piano. Sophie sat waiting for her cue to begin. Mr. Finch wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Diana. She smiled politely, probably thinking he was acknowledging parents. He smiled back, held the eye contact a beat too long, then seemed to remember where he was. He finally nodded at Sophie to begin. Sophie started playing. The first phrase came out beautifully, her weeks of practice evident in every note. I could see her gaining confidence as she moved through the opening section. She made a small mistake in the 3rd line, a note that came out sharp, but recovered quickly. The piece had a tricky rhythm change in the middle that she'd been struggling with, but she navigated it carefully. She reached the final section, and I realized she was going to finish without any major errors. She played the last chord and held it, her hands staying on the keys exactly as she'd been taught. The audience applauded. Sophie stood and gave a small bow, her face flushed but smiling. Mr. Finch stepped forward to give his comments. I braced for the criticism, for him to point out the sharp note and the hesitation in the middle. Instead, he said, "That was a lovely interpretation, Sophie. I particularly enjoyed your dynamics in the second half. You've worked very hard on this piece and it shows. Well done." Sophie's eyes went huge. The audience applauded again. Sophie walked off the stage looking stunned. Diana leaned over and said she did great. I couldn't speak. Mr. Finch had just publicly praised my daughter after 6 months of telling her she had no talent. The only variable that had changed was Diana being in the audience. The recital continued. I barely registered the other performances. Sophie sat between Diana and me, still processing what had happened. During intermission, Mr. Finch approached us. He smiled at Diana and introduced himself, said it was wonderful to finally meet Sophie's mother, that Sophie talked about her often. That was a lie. Sophie barely spoke during lessons, because Mr. Finch didn't encourage conversation. He said Sophie had really come into her own in recent weeks, that he'd seen tremendous growth. Diana thanked him and said she was proud of Sophie's progress. Mr. Finch said Sophie had natural musicality that was starting to shine through, that with continued dedication she could become quite accomplished. Every word was the opposite of what he'd been saying for months. He stood there chatting with Diana about music education and the importance of supporting young musicians, completely ignoring me even though I was standing right there. He laughed at Diana's comments, leaned in when she spoke, kept finding excuses to extend the conversation. Diana was polite, but clearly trying to end the interaction so we could get back to our seats. He finally excused himself when the second half was about to start, but not before saying he looked forward to seeing her at future events. On the drive home, Diana said Mr. Finch seemed nice, and she was glad Sophie had such a supportive teacher. I pulled the car over into a parking lot and told her everything. Every cruel comment, every criticism, every time he'd made Sophie cry. I showed her the notes I'd kept, the recordings of practice sessions proving Sophie had been working hard. I told her about Mrs. Cho's assessment, about Catherine Odom's daughter who developed performance anxiety. Diana's face went pale as I talked. She asked why I hadn't told her how bad it was. I said I had, but she'd been so busy with work and I'd been handling it. She said this wasn't handling it. This was Sophie being emotionally abused by someone we were paying to teach her. I said I knew, that I'd been documenting everything to file a complaint, that we were switching teachers in January. Diana said January wasn't good enough. We were pulling Sophie out immediately, and she was going to make sure everyone knew what kind of person Garrett Finch was. The next morning, Diana called Mr. Finch and told him Sophie would not be returning for lessons. He sounded genuinely surprised and asked if something had happened. Diana said yes. 6 months of psychological abuse had happened. He immediately got defensive and said Sophie was a difficult student who required firm guidance. Diana said she'd talked to other parents and a professional piano teacher who all confirmed Sophie had talent and adequate progress for her experience level. Mr. Finch said if we wanted to coddle our daughter and deny her honest feedback, that was our choice, but we were doing her a disservice. Diana said the only disservice was exposing Sophie to a teacher who got off on destroying children's confidence. She hung up while he was still sputtering excuses. Diana contacted Catherine Odom and got the names of 2 other parents who'd had negative experiences with Mr. Finch. We met with them over the following week. One mother, Angela Brennan, said her son quit piano entirely after 9 months with Mr. Finch, that he'd gone from loving music to having panic attacks before lessons. The other parent, David Yu, said his daughter stuck it out for a year, but her self-esteem was shattered. David had tried to address it with Mr. Finch and been told he was being overprotective, that serious musical training required discipline and sacrifice. None of us had realized other families were struggling because Mr. Finch treated parents individually and students never talked about what happened in lessons. He'd isolated us all. Diana drafted a letter detailing the pattern of emotional abuse and sent it to the State Music Teachers Association, the local Arts Council, and the community center that had recommended Mr. Finch to several families. She included statements from all 4 families and documentation of what our children had experienced. Catherine provided emails where Mr. Finch had told her daughter she should consider giving up piano because she lacked natural ability. Angela had recordings of her son crying and saying he was stupid and couldn't do anything right. David had saved a text thread where Mr. Finch berated him for questioning the teacher's methods. I contributed my detailed notes, Mrs. Cho's professional assessment of Sophie's abilities, and the contrast between Mr. Finch's private criticism and his public praise once Diana appeared. The response came faster than I expected. The State Music Teachers Association opened an investigation. They sent an inspector to observe Mr. Finch's teaching and review his methods. They interviewed current and former students. They requested his curriculum plans and assessment criteria. Mr. Finch was furious. He sent a group email to all current parents saying he was being targeted by disgruntled families who couldn't accept that their children lacked musical aptitude, that he maintained the highest standards, and wouldn't lower them to appease entitled parents. Several parents responded defending him, saying their children loved his classes and were thriving. But several others reached out privately to Diana, asking if what she'd written was true, if Mr. Finch had really treated our children that way. One of those parents was a woman named Isabel Navarro, whose daughter was one of Mr. Finch's star pupils. Isabel said she'd noticed Mr. Finch seemed to have favorites, that he praised her daughter extensively, while barely acknowledging other students. She'd assumed it was because her daughter was more talented, but now she was questioning whether the disparity was actually about skill or something else. She asked if we'd noticed any pattern to which students got favorable treatment versus which ones got torn down. Diana, Catherine, Angela, David, and Isabel met for coffee and compared notes. We pulled up photos of the students from recital programs. A pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. The students Mr. Finch praised and encouraged tended to have mothers who were young, attractive, and frequently present at lessons and events. The students he criticized had mothers who were older or less conventionally attractive, or fathers who did most of the transportation like I did. It wasn't absolute, but the correlation was strong enough to be disturbing. Isabel had brought her daughter Nina to that coffee meeting. Nina was 11 and had been studying with Mr. Finch for 3 years. Isabel asked Nina gently if Mr. Finch ever said things about the parents or asked about them. Nina hesitated, then said Mr. Finch sometimes asked which parent was picking her up from lessons. If she said her mom, he'd seem happier and would spend extra time teaching. If she said her dad or grandmother, he'd rush through the lesson and seem annoyed. Isabel asked if he'd ever said anything inappropriate. Nina said once he'd commented that her mom had beautiful eyes, and another time he'd asked if her parents were still married. Isabel's face went white. She'd thought Mr. Finch was just friendly and interested in his students' lives. Now she realized he'd been using children to get information about their mothers. Diana took all of this new information and sent an updated report to the State Music Teachers Association and added a formal complaint to the local police department. Not criminal charges, but a documented report of concerning behavior involving minors. The police investigator was a woman named Detective Iris Campbell, who specialized in cases involving children. She took our statements seriously, interviewed the parents and several of the children with their parents present. She said Mr. Finch's behavior didn't rise to the level of criminal conduct, but it was absolutely inappropriate and concerning. She compiled a report and sent it to the Music Teachers Association and the community center that referred families to him. The investigation concluded in late January. The State Music Teachers Association revoked Mr. Finch's membership and teaching certification. Their report stated that he had demonstrated a pattern of emotionally manipulative teaching practices, showed preferential treatment based on non-musical criteria, and created an unsafe learning environment for multiple students. They noted the correlation between his treatment of students and his apparent interest in their mothers was especially concerning and violated professional boundaries. The report was made available to the public through the association's website. The community center removed Mr. Finch from their recommended teacher list and sent an email to all families who'd used their referral services in the past 5 years, informing them of the investigation results and offering resources for children who might need support recovering from negative musical experiences. Mr. Finch's studio lost over half its students within 2 weeks. Parents pulled their children, even some who'd been defending him, once they read the official report and understood the full scope of what had been happening. He tried to fight back with a lawsuit alleging defamation, but his lawyer apparently advised him to drop it once they reviewed the documentation we'd compiled. You can't claim defamation when everything said about you is true and backed by witnesses and evidence. His reputation in the local music community was destroyed. Teachers who'd recommended him publicly retracted those recommendations. The prestigious music program he'd claimed to have connections with issued a statement saying they had no formal relationship with Mr. Finch and did not endorse his teaching methods. Sophie started lessons with Mrs. Cho in February. The difference was immediate and striking. Mrs. Cho was encouraging but honest, correcting mistakes while praising effort and growth. She gave Sophie pieces that challenged her but were appropriate for her skill level. She asked Sophie what she wanted to learn and incorporated those interests into her curriculum. After her first lesson, Sophie came home smiling and said Mrs. Cho told her she had good musical instincts and just needed practice to develop technique. After her third lesson, Sophie said she loved piano again. By March, she was playing pieces far more complex than anything Mr. Finch had assigned, and she was playing them well. Mrs. Cho submitted Sophie for a regional young musicians showcase in April. Sophie performed and received an honorable mention certificate. She hung it on her wall next to a photo of her at the piano. Diana and I attended a parent meeting at the Music Teachers Association in May, where they presented new guidelines for identifying and reporting emotionally abusive teaching practices. They'd created a checklist of warning signs: teachers who used excessive criticism without balanced praise, teachers who showed dramatic favoritism, teachers who isolated students and discouraged parent observation, teachers who made students cry regularly or developed performance anxiety. They trained teachers on maintaining appropriate boundaries with students and families. Our case had become the catalyst for systematic change. One administrator told Diana privately that they'd known problematic teachers existed but hadn't had the framework or evidence to address it effectively. Our documentation and willingness to speak up had given them the tools to protect future students. I ran into Mr. Finch once in July at a grocery store. He was alone, looked older and tired. He saw me, and his expression hardened. He started to say something, then seemed to think better of it and turned away. I didn't say anything either. There was nothing left to say. He'd lost his career, his reputation, his livelihood. Not because we destroyed him, but because we simply told the truth about what he'd done. The consequences were his own making. Sophie continued with Mrs. Cho through the summer and into the fall. She performed in a recital in September, her first since the one where everything clicked into place for me. Diana and I both attended, along with Sophie's grandparents and her aunt. Sophie played a contemporary piece she'd chosen herself, something with complex rhythms and unexpected harmonies. She played it beautifully, confidently, like someone who knew her worth and abilities. Mrs. Cho gave commentary afterward praising Sophie's interpretation and her growth as a musician. Sophie beamed. On the drive home, she said she wanted to keep taking piano lessons for a long time, maybe even through high school. Diana said she could take lessons as long as she wanted. Looking back, I'm angry at myself for not pulling Sophie out of Mr. Finch's studio sooner. I knew something was wrong. I saw her confidence deteriorating week by week. But I'd been raised to respect authority, to trust that teachers knew what they were doing, to believe that difficult experiences built character. It took seeing the contrast of Mr. Finch's treatment when Diana was present versus when she wasn't, to fully understand that his behavior had nothing to do with teaching and everything to do with his inappropriate interest in mothers he found attractive. My daughter had been collateral damage in his disturbing pattern of behavior. But I'm also proud of how we fought back once we understood what was happening. We documented everything, connected with other families, involved appropriate authorities, and didn't back down when Mr. Finch tried to discredit us. We protected Sophie and potentially dozens of future students from experiencing what she went through. We changed policies and created frameworks that will help other parents identify problematic teachers before their children suffer long-term damage. Sophie still plays piano. She's 12 now, preparing for her first full recital performance of an advanced classical piece. She practices because she wants to, because she loves music, because she's discovered she actually does have talent and musicality. Mrs. Cho says Sophie has the potential to pursue music seriously if that's what she chooses. Sophie hasn't decided yet. She's also interested in art and science and writing, but piano remains something she loves, something that brings her joy, something she's genuinely good at. Mr. Finch tried to take that away from her, tried to convince her she was talentless and stupid and wasting everyone's time. He failed. Sophie knows her worth now. She knows the difference between a teacher who tears down and one who builds up. She knows that when something feels wrong, she should speak up, that we'll believe her and fight for her. That's the real lesson from this whole nightmare. Not about piano or music or teaching methods, but about trusting your child when they tell you something isn't right. About investigating when your gut says something is off, even if the person in authority seems credible. about documentation and evidence and refusing to be gaslit by people who abuse their positions of power, about connecting with others who've had similar experiences and realizing you're not alone, not overreacting, not imagining things, about fighting back even when it's exhausting and uncomfortable and easier to just walk away quietly, about making sure there are consequences for people who harm children, even if the harm is emotional rather than physical. Sophie will carry some scars from those 6 months with Mr. Finch. She's more anxious about performing than she might have been otherwise. She's quicker to assume she's made a mistake even when she hasn't. She needs more reassurance than other kids her age. But she's healing, growing, reclaiming her relationship with music on her own terms. And she knows, beyond any doubt, that her parents will always believe her and protect her, even when it means taking on authority figures and systems that would prefer we stay quiet. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.